Well, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. A few logistics before we start here with our GreenSpot conversations about the Columbus Urban Forestry Master Plan. It's a great day to be outside if you haven't been out there yet. Could be a great day to go plant a tree if you have one. And we'll talk a little bit about that here. But before we do, I wanted to let you know that we are recording and we are live streaming on the GreenSpot social media on Facebook anyhow. I want to talk a little bit about GreenSpot before we start, and even before that, just to let you know that GreenSpot is housed at Public Utilities, and we are in the Sustainable Columbus office. And when we think about sustainability, we really think about, sorry about that. We think about three things moving together in the same direction. When we have environment, economy, and equity, when we have those things going in the same direction, that's when we truly thrive as a community, and that's what our goals are. In terms of GreenSpot, many of you all have heard me say this probably a million times, but it's a program city started to encourage people to go green at home as well as businesses. We like to say we inspire, we educate, and we recognize those that adopt sustainable practices, and we provide them with ideas of how to do that. It is a membership-based program, but it is free to join. And if you're in Franklin County or surrounding area, you can be a GreenSpot member, although to get the full benefits of membership, you have to be in the city of Columbus. You can see our membership numbers there. We have GreenSpot neighborhoods as well, and over 40 different ideas of how you can live a little bit more sustainably. And we look at sustainability in the categories of education, of conserving and protecting water, of reduce, reuse, recycle, of conserving energy, and green transportation. These are kind of underestimated, I would say, numbers of our GreenSpot universe of how much we've saved and reduced. These are just what people are reporting. So we know not everybody is reporting on their savings, but you can see it is significant. And of course, that is the famous Columbus deer looking over the Scioto River. All right, so we're going to get to it now. And so today's topic is the city's Urban Forestry Master Plan, which is rooted in preserving and growing Columbus's tree canopy. It was adopted last year, and we'll hear how the progress is going. The ultimate goal of the plan is 40% tree canopy by 2050. And I'd like to introduce Rosalie Hendon, who is an environmental planner with Columbus Recreation and Parks. Rosalie, welcome. I will go ahead and pull up the other presentation, and we will. Right. Can you all see this presentation?
I can see it, Dave. Thank you.
Great. So just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Sure. Okay. Good afternoon. Good to be with all of you. I'm Rosalie Hendon. Dave said I'm an environmental planner with Recreation and Parks, and I also served as a project manager while we were creating the Urban Forestry Master Plan. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about what's in the plan, how we developed it, and then what implementation has looked like in the past year. It was approved by City Council and by the Recreation and Parks Commission last April. Next slide, please. Okay, so why do we have an Urban Forestry Master Plan? Well, this is the first one that the City of Columbus has created. And we are facing a lot of challenges as a city, and so trees can often be a solution. So some of these challenges, I'm sure you're more than familiar. We have the fastest growing heat island in the country, meaning if you look at this graph, areas that have high amounts of hard surfaces, such as downtown, and really just a lot of places within the city are hotter. They retain more heat than areas outside of the city that have more natural, surfaces, habitats, trees, fields, etc. So when a study was done of the 60 largest cities in the U.S. several years ago, Columbus had the fastest growing difference between our city heat and other areas outside of the city. We are projected to add about 1 million residents in our region by 2050, so we're going to be experiencing really quick growth. I'll show you a slide here in a minute, but we have relatively low tree canopy cover compared to some of our peers in the region. And we're very familiar right after the past several years with the public health challenges that we face as a community. And, you know, in addition to, of course, all the challenges that the pandemic has brought, we are also the heat and air pollution, you know, that affects folks with respiratory issues. All of that can get exacerbated in an urban environment. And we're also facing climate change, which is just as much a stressor on our residents as it will be on our trees. So for all of these reasons, we felt that it was time to create some sort of master plan for all of the trees in Columbus. Next slide. So trees, as you know, they provide so many benefits, and some we can quantify and some we really can't. But here's a couple numbers about the trees here in Columbus. So Columbus has 22% tree canopy cover, meaning 22% of our land is covered by trees. And so for that 22% canopy cover, those trees are capturing 168,000 tons of carbon each year from the atmosphere. They're removing 2.5 million pounds of air pollution, so they're actually filtering pollutants with their leaves, and then intercepting rainwater and soaking up rainwater, which helps reduce flooding and filtering that water as well. So 331 million gallons. And again, this is based on that every tree in Columbus, public and private property, that 22% canopy. And that has a real value to our residents and to the city. Next slide. So a little bit about the master plan. Like I mentioned, it's the first master plan for all of our trees, both public and private land. That's our entire urban forest, right? That's the term, the urban forest. And it has short-term and long-term goals, but overall, and we'll go over the vision, but we want to preserve, maintain, and increase our tree canopy. So I mentioned that Columbus is at 22%. You can see on the bar graph here that we have higher tree canopy than Cleveland, but we are lower than a lot of other cities like Pittsburgh at 40%, Cincinnati at 39%, Louisville 37%, Minneapolis 30%. So you can kind of get a sense if you've been to some of these other cities what that canopy feels like as you're walking and biking, traveling through the city. Next slide. Through the master planning process, equity has been a real through line in the plan and the planning process. So it's a priority for our mayor and for our city officials to have a socially equitable city. It's also a priority for our stakeholders. So to that end, we did a priority planting analysis with an equity lens as part of our master plan. We selected different factors that we had data for that showed a correlation in other research with tree canopy. So we selected about 18 different factors that we could study because we had some sort of data source. And like I said, they were supported in the literature that there was a relationship between tree canopy and these other factors. We presented all of those factors as options to our stakeholder group, which is a group of about 30 folks, about half city, half community members. And our project team actually they voted for these 9 factors here, which are families in poverty, educational attainment, median household income, percent non-white population, asthma, COPD, and mental health, and then property and violent crime. So you can see it's a mix of demographic, health, and crime factors that we wanted to study as it related to tree canopy. So the map here on the right is what's called a bivariate map, so it compares 2 different variables. We took those 9 factors and made a social equity index. So every census tract within the city was being scored between 0 and 4, 4 showing the highest need. And then what you're seeing here I'm used to having a cursor, sorry, in the bottom left with the legend, we've highlighted in red the areas, thank you, Dave, that are both high ranking on the social equity score, so there's high need, and low tree canopy. So we really, this map is a tool for us to prioritize our investment in the census tracts where trees are going to do the most good, right? Where there's low tree canopy and high social equity need. Next slide. So this next map is, City of Columbus. I should mention that because sometimes even I didn't know before I worked for the city that the map of our city boundaries looks like this. So those areas that are that don't have a color, they're not within City of Columbus. So you can see Upper Arlington, Bexley, Whitehall, Worthington, et cetera. So there's different cities kind of embedded within Columbus. So I just like to mention that right off the bat, because the data that we have on our trees, when we did that study back in, it was published in 2015, but based on 2013 data, we actually only looked at City of Columbus boundaries. So that's why this map looks a little bit like this sheet. So the areas that are within City of Columbus, we've mapped out the different communities, and they are labeled 1 through 41, right? So there's 41 kind of distinct different community boundaries. And not all of them are really true communities. We do have like the airport, we have a couple industrial corridors, we have Wolf Park. So there's 6 of those that are not true communities where people live and work. So that's why if you're looking on the left, and I apologize that it is small, those 6 neighbor communities were not scored for equity because there's not really the population density to support the same sort of investment that we're trying to prioritize trees where people live and work. But for the others, you can see that the map is darker green where there's more tree canopy, lighter where there's less. Our least canopied community is downtown, which makes sense, right, because of all the hard surfaces. Our area with the most tree canopy is Clintonville at 41%. And everything else is kind of in between. So the chart there on the left is showing both the equity score, again, between 0 and 4, 4 being the most need based on those factors that we talked about. And then the right of that is showing the canopy cover per that community, and that gray line there is showing the citywide average, again, which is 22%. So just another way to look at this data. And I think what I try to communicate around this topic is that low tree canopy is important, and we take that into consideration. And just as important is the need of the community, right, to the benefits that those trees can provide, where they'll be really helping clear the air, helping folks who are suffering from asthma and COPD, those respiratory illnesses, and facing all these other challenges, right, in some of our neighborhoods. So just another way of looking at that data. Next slide. Okay, so that was a little bit about the plan. Within the plan, we worked again with our stakeholder group to create a vision for our urban forest, again, for all the trees in Columbus. And this is what we wrote together: to prioritize, preserve, and grow tree canopy in Columbus, equitably across neighborhoods to improve health and quality of life for all residents. And what I really like to emphasize in this vision statement is the first couple verbs, right? Prioritize, preserve, and grow. So I think sometimes when we think about trees, and I do the same thing because I get very excited, we love planting trees. A lot of people, that's where we want to think about. Where are we going to plant the trees? How many trees? What kind of trees? Where are they going to go? And that is important to grow our canopy. But just as important is preserving and prioritizing the trees that we already have, because we all know how slowly trees can grow, right? And how it can take decades for a young, newly planted tree to contribute the same benefits as an established older tree is doing today. So that's where I just like to emphasize that beyond growing, we're also wanting to prioritize and preserve our trees. And the plan kind of covers all 3 of those areas. Okay, thanks, Steve. Next slide. Out of that vision, we created 3 goals. These are canopy goals. So we talked about the 22%. That's one metric, but it is a common metric for cities to use when they create these sorts of master plans. And that's the one that we're using. So to measure ourselves, right? So the overall goal is to reach a citywide tree canopy cover of 40% by 2050. That 40%, again, the last time that we checked, which was based on 2013 data, we were at 22% average. So this is essentially doubling our canopy, especially considering that we've had a lot of changes as a city since 2013, right? But 40% was something that was really important to our stakeholders. It's really important to quality of life, and within it works well with our climate action plan, which also has goals based around 2050. So it's a little bit of background on that goal. The other two goals I like to think of, they're shorter term, and they're kind of building us towards that overall 40% goal. So we have a goal to stop net canopy loss by 2030. So we're always going to lose trees, right? We're always going to lose trees to weather and disease and development. But the goal is, before we can even grow our canopy, we need to stop losing canopy. And so that goal is really to kind of provide that foundation of stopping net canopy loss to make sure that we're coming out at least even. Goal 3 is to invest in equitable canopy across all neighborhoods by 2030. So that as well, I like to call attention to the word invest, because some of our neighborhoods that have a lot of need may not actually be that far off from the average, but those trees may need a lot of care, right? And so that's the idea, is that not only are we wanting to add trees in our neighborhoods and plant and grow, we also want to be maintaining and preserving the trees that we already have. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into what's within our plan. What was actually recommended in the Urban Forestry Master Plan, and what kind of progress have we made to date? So within the plan, there are 4 strategies, and so that's how these slides are arranged, is by each strategy. So the first strategy is community coordination and collaboration. So within that set of strategies, we talked about creating a tree coalition. In some of our peer cities, like, well, Cleveland and Charlotte, North Carolina, a tree coalition, Boston, there's been a community-led group that focuses on tree efforts citywide. Columbus has a lot of wonderful environmental groups focused on trees, but they tend to be more neighborhood or watershed focused and not citywide. So the idea here was to have some sort of umbrella group that could really kind of coordinate, be just a forum for folks to kind of talk to each other and perhaps create some synergy around their individual tree planting projects or preservation projects or maintenance projects, right? So we did convene our stakeholders to discuss this. That's what this screen capture is here back in last November. We have our consultant, Rachel Conti of Urban Canopy Works, who helped write the plan and conducted the outreach for the plan itself. We've kept her on to assist with implementation, and she is available for members of the community who are interested to talk about organizing and what could this look like and what have other cities done. We've also begun to improve our communications and collaborations, both within the city and with the community. That was a key finding of the Urban Forestry Master Plan, was that it's a large city and we don't always do the best job of talking to each other. So we've begun interdepartmental meetings. We now meet every other month with public utilities and forestry, and then we also meet quarterly with public service, and we've had some other meetings as well. And one of the things we talk about a lot is tree data, and making sure, to this point, forestry, which is within recreation and parks, has captured what forestry does each year, what we plant, what we remove, what we prune. Really, we need to be gathering data from what other departments are doing as well across the city. Thank you. Next slide. So best practices is the second set of strategies. We talked about the priority planting analysis. Again, that's a tool to create a socially equitable planting plan. So once our tree inventory is complete, which I'll talk more about at the end of the year, we'll be set up to create a longer term planting plan. Forestry has kind of been reactive in the past years. And so the idea here is to have a longer term planting plan and kind of be strategic about what areas of the city we're going to be planting, because we do have limited resources and we want to make sure that we're being really effective and, again, equitable in our plantings. In addition to continuing to fill existing resident requests, right? We're not discarding that. We're filling some key forestry vacancies and working on a best practices manual as well, which I'll talk about later as part of our public tree code update. Next slide. The third strategy is dedication of resources, right? That was something we heard a lot from our stakeholders, was what we need resources to implement this plan. And that's true. And tree work, as I'm sure you're aware, is also expensive, right? Anything we're talking about with trees is also just an expensive proposition. So resources are critical. I mentioned our urban forest data. We have two really key sets of data, if you will. One is our citywide, really it's a public tree inventory, and that's what we've been working on updated. I just mentioned it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then the urban tree canopy assessment is that percent canopy, right? And that last time we did that was in 2013. So both of these data sets, and I hope you find this interesting. I think data is fascinating, right? I know not everybody does. They're both important for different reasons, right? So the inventory is somebody, an arborist, walking to each individual tree and taking some key information like the size, the species, the condition. The urban tree canopy assessment, imagine we're above the city looking down on it, right? So you're looking at really a picture of the city and determining what percent of land is covered by trees as opposed to other things like water, buildings, roads, et cetera, agricultural fields. So both of those things are important for our management and to be measuring our goals. We've also been working on supplemental funding methods for forestry. So we have gotten federal grant funding from the Housing and Urban Development Administration. It's Community Development Block Grant Funding, pardon the acronym there. We've been able to leverage that both for tree planting and for our inventory work. And we've also created a Columbus Tree Fund at our foundation for folks who want to contribute directly to the implementation of this plan. Next slide. Finally, our fourth strategy is around stronger policies. So if you look at this chart, this is a page out of our Urban Forestry Master Plan. We did an analysis of our policies as related to trees in Columbus compared to 3 other cities. We compared ourselves to Gahanna and Dublin and Charlotte, North Carolina. And I know those are kind of strange choices on the surface. The reason that we included Gahanna and Dublin was because, of course, they're very different from Columbus in terms of size and population, et cetera, but they are neighboring municipalities. The idea here is that if developers are working in these cities and they have stricter regulations than Columbus, kind of builds the argument that Columbus could have stricter tree protection as well. Charlotte, North Carolina is a peer city to Columbus in terms of population and size generally. So you can see just at a glance that these other cities have much more extensive tree protection policies than we do here in Columbus. What we do have is existing public tree code that makes it illegal to damage a tree or remove a public tree, making sure that forestry has to issue a permit for anybody to touch a public tree. So we do have that. We are working to improve that code and modernize it, but at least we have something on the books. Otherwise, those little X's that you see, the land use for multifamily residential and specific species, were actually kind of interesting. When we were looking through our code in the university district, there's a zoning overlay that restricts removal of trees over 10-inch caliper, which is not the right term. It should be, diameter. But anyway, I don't know that that's enforced at all. That's why there's an X. So citywide, we lack any protection on private property beyond, for preservation, right? There's some landscaping and screening requirements that exist, but there's nothing to stop a developer from removing every single tree on a property and then putting back in the required trees per zoning code, but there's nothing for preservation at this time. So those two projects, updating public tree code and improving private, or creating a private tree protection, those are the actions within policies. Next slide, thank you. Okay, and I'm just going to share a quick overview of a couple goals in progress. So education was a key piece of feedback from our stakeholders that we needed more education and outreach. So we did create, actually with GreenSpot, Steve, really helped make it happen, how to plant a tree and how to prune a tree in Columbus, Ohio. So the idea being that if we can empower homeowners to plant on private property, that's where there's a lot of opportunity and space for those large canopy trees, much more often than on public property, right? In your yard, you have a lot more soil volume, you can support a larger tree. So just trying to empower with that knowledge for homeowners. Next slide. I mentioned our public tree inventory. So this is what I'm talking about here on the right. You can see it's German Village. Every green dot is a public tree. And you can see Schiller Park covered with park trees as well. So by the end of this project, we'll not only have updated street trees. We started with street trees because there's some more potential for, safety issues. We wanted to be aware of any trees that might impact pedestrians or, anybody around the street. But by the end, we'll also have updated park trees, golf trees, and land bank trees. So all public trees will be updated by the end of the year. We're on track. We've already completed 7 of those communities that we discussed. Our first was South Linden in 2020. We prioritized them because South Linden had the highest score for social equity, went there first. And then you can see the other 6, Southside, Southwest, Milo Grogan, North Central, Far South, and Franklinton. All of those were also showing up on our social equity analysis. We've managed to leverage even more federal funding. And I mentioned that other key data set was the urban tree canopy assessment. And what I'm excited to share with you is we talked about in that map how some data was missing if you were outside the city. This time, we'll be doing county-wide. So, and we'll be getting a fact sheet for every jurisdiction. So if you live in Hilliard or you live in a township, Mifflin Township, right? All of these individual political jurisdictions will at least have a fact sheet summarizing their tree canopy percentages and some other key statistics. So we're very excited. We're collaborating with the county on that, and with Franklin County. And in addition to those fact sheets, we're also going to have a report that'll compare the change, at least for City of Columbus, from the last time that we checked, on this canopy stuff, which is 2013. Next slide. We mentioned how important resources are. We've been working on that a lot on the public tree side of things. So forestry has done a lot of work to propose a budget expansion. One of the findings in the master plan was that our staff were managing more trees than the national average by a lot, like 7,000 public trees, and the average was like 4,000. So we have a lot of trees here in Columbus. We're finding even more with that inventory that we weren't aware of. So we need our staff to increase as well to make sure that we can actually be doing proactive care on our trees, right? We have not had a pruning cycle, which is a best practice to make sure you're touching a tree, you're inspecting it, you're doing any preventative care that you would need to do on a cycle like every 7 to 10 years. We've been able to hire some full-time staff as a result of this plan. We've gotten a lot of traction. We have a plan reviewer now for forestry. We have another regional arborist. We've been able to revise the city forester job description to make it more of a leader and someone who can focus on policy and planning and coordination and collaboration, in addition to just more of an operations focus that it's been in the past. So if you know anyone who is interested, this position is open today until May 27th, and we are eager to have as many candidates to review as possible. Make sure we get a really good leader for forestry who can implement this historic plan. We've been awarded $1.5 million capital funds from the mayor's office. It was appropriated last fall for implementation of this plan. Again, that's going to the staffing, the inventory, contracts, and equipment. And we've also been able to leverage over $1 million last year for contract tree plantings out of both our own capital dollars in our department and grant funding. Next slide. I just wanted to share that this is an interesting project we have in the far south neighborhood of Columbus. The right half of this park was an existing park, but we were able to purchase Columbus City School property that they were selling. There was a school that I believe closed in 2008, and it's just been sitting vacant Stockbridge Elementary. So we were able to purchase and double the size of the park. So it's now 22 acres, and we're planning on installing about 2,400 native trees, creating a walking loop, having educational signs, and you can see there'll be like different pockets of trees with mowed paths in between so folks can enter into the space. But this is kind of a large-scale reforestation of a park that's very new for our department. You know, typically we're trying to conserve land that's already wooded, but here we've purchased a field, demolished a school building, and a huge parking lot. So we've opened up about 3 acres that used to be hard surface and are now able to be planted. And so this is kind of a pilot project. It's exciting, and it's very much in line with the Urban Forestry Master Plan. Next slide. And that's everything I have prepared for you today. Happy to take any questions, and thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Rosalie. It's always fascinating to hear about trees and what's going on in the city with them. And whenever I look at a map of Columbus, it kind of reminds me of a tree. So I don't know if you've heard that before, but I'm curious what other folks think, and trying to find it. I did have a quick question. So on this slide here, the implementation next steps, under regulated features on private property, at least the wetlands part of the forests and wetlands, I believe that is protected under Ohio EPA and US EPA, but the buffer zone where those trees might be, that is not protected under those permits. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that in case somebody was like, hey, I have a wetland, maybe I could, whatever with it, but you do need a permit to impact a wetland.
Good point, right.
And then there it is, and it's even green. So to me, that's totally looks like a tree. You have the roots down here and everything. We did have a question. I think you might have addressed some of this, but I wanted to raise it again. Question is, who is responsible for trimming the trees? I'm assuming in the right-of-way or on public property. And then in the areas with poor equity scores, the trees are not trimmed and kept up like the trees in other areas. So if we increase the amount of trees in those areas, who is responsible? Who is going to keep them upkept?
Great questions, and thank you for making that clarification, Dave. I appreciate it about the wetlands. So it's a great point. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to really clarify, because I have in my work over the past couple of years come across residents who don't realize that trees in the tree lawn are the city's responsibility. And that can be, that's just an important thing to know, that if there's an issue with that tree, if it's not safe, if you think it needs to be pruned, if you'd like to add a tree, anything related to that space, you can put in a 311 request. That is probably the most effective way to communicate with forestry, because the 311s automatically generate a work order in their work order system, and an arborist will at least go out and inspect the site and then assign it a priority. So, a small dead tree is not as dangerous as a large dead tree for, those sorts of priorities that they assess. But yes, so any public tree is forestry's responsibility. Now, I did mention how we've been reactive in the past. So that kind of, I think, speaks to, it's absolutely an equity issue, and that's why we're trying to shift away from just reacting and going after resident requests to also incorporating this proactive, focus on these equity areas. Because when folks don't realize, may not know, that they can ask the city to take care of this tree, that it is our responsibility, or just may not have the bandwidth to reach out to 311. Really, I think it's been kind of a squeaky wheel getting the grease, just because of in terms of bandwidth. We've been very reactive. So that it could be a factor, and we definitely want to move away, like I said, just from resident requests. So any public trees going into these equity areas will be the city's responsibility. And as we're going through and doing our inventory, the first step is just to gather the data. Any high priority tree that's dangerous, we're taking care of quickly, right? As soon as the information comes in from the consultant, we make a work order to take care of it. So there is some tree care going alongside the inventory. We're not waiting until it's done to take any sort of action, but we will be creating, like I said, some sort of pruning cycle to make sure we're reaching all of the city as well and addressing, you know, those high priority and then medium priority and then low priority prunes and removals as well. That helps.
Right. Yeah, and there's a couple other questions. So is there likely to be a requirement for property management companies for how much tree coverage they have at their property? And kind of dovetailing off of that, are there any things in the works? So if a new development, you know, we've all kind of seen, sometimes a new development comes in, they clear out all the trees and then they name the streets after the names of the trees. Is there any type of look into having them preserve some existing trees?
Great questions. In terms of requirements for property management companies, I should say first, we haven't started the project for private tree protection. So we will be reaching out for public comment, likely, you know, either the first or second quarter of next year. So definitely share all of your ideas, please, for what we could do on private property. I do think the focus will be on development, the development phase, rather than regulating individual property owners. So because that's where there's going to be a lot of impact, right? If there's existing wooded stands and everything gets cleared, that's really going to impact our canopy more than, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 trees being removed here or there. And frankly, just administrative time that it would take to enforce something like that and potentially political will. I think we're going to go for the development phase of property ownership. That said, yeah, we haven't talked much about property management companies or, you know, these spaces that are already existing, though we do want to incentivize private tree plantings. But in terms of regulations, like I said, I think while we haven't started to write it, the preliminary research that we've been doing, I think we're going to focus on development and how we can either preserve existing trees, or if whatever the way that the building site plan is, it doesn't allow for, you know, that certain threshold, which again, haven't written it, but we could, you know, maybe mitigate those trees. Well, they should have been protected, but because they're going to be impacted, now you need to replant however many. So that's kind of early thoughts there in terms of preservation.
Yeah, I'm also thinking too, like the education component is so important. Like I live in Clintonville, and just in a couple blocks where I am at, I've seen over the last, I don't know, 6 years, some really large trees on private property that have been cut down. Now, I don't know the reasons, like maybe they were diseased or something like that, but at least from the outside, it's like, oh, it's always hurts a little bit when you see a tree whose diameter like that is being cut down. A couple other questions. One on Facebook is, and this is very specific to the new sheep farm park. Will trees be planted there? I
believe some trees will be planted there. The plans are still under development for West Case Park. However, there are restrictions with the OSU airport right across the street in terms of what height they're able to reach. So I know that that's a consideration for that site. That's kind of unusual compared to our other parks. But yes, the preliminary plans, the conceptual designs that I've seen, there should be at least some tree planting.
Right. And then there's another question in the chat, and you've kind of addressed this, but in terms of the timeline for protecting trees on private property, you had mentioned the new developments is kind of the area of focus. There was a question about, is there a plan to inventory trees on private property? Or I don't know, will there be like a database where the public can register? Maybe they have like a 100-year-old tree or 200-year-old tree on their property. They want to register with the city in case they move. They want, it to be known that that tree is there.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. We have had some discussion about, what about private property? Now, our urban tree canopy assessment does cover the whole city, or really the whole county now, public and private, right? It doesn't distinguish that tree cover where it's, what sort of property it's on. But in terms of an inventory, we're only covering public trees. And I should have said this earlier in the presentation, 70% of our trees are growing on private property. So there's many more trees on private property than there is on public, which is another reason that preservation on private property is important. So when it comes to inventorying, I think there would be a lot of barriers, both in terms of volume. It's kind of expensive to have an arborist go to visit every tree. It's averaging $5, $6 per tree for this inventory. So by the time all is said and done, we'll spend over $1 million just on the public tree inventory. So I think cost would be a concern, but also just the concerns about, the liability of going on to private property. I think as a city, we always, struggle with, there would need to be permissions, et cetera. So now in terms of voluntarily folks, identifying trees, I think that would be a really interesting project and something we would definitely be interested to see, because, what's on public property may be similar to what's on private, but the species composition and age, and it would be very interesting data. We would be really interested to see it. And the last thing I wanted to say, Dave, you mentioned about really large trees. The state does have a program called Champion Big Trees, and we've identified it's like the largest tree of that species in the state. So we have a couple in our parks. They're on our website. But I don't think it matters if it's public or private property. So that might be of interest to folks to see if your tree would qualify as a Champion Big Tree through the state.
Awesome. I also want to let folks know about the question about where to get free saplings, and it kind of ties into, like you had mentioned earlier, Rosalie, like in Central Ohio, we're really fortunate to have very active environmental groups that push the city to be green and to keep being green. I wanted to give a shout out to Green Columbus. They hold the Earth Day celebration and coordinate the Earth Day service sites, which is the largest volunteer in the country, organized service sites in the country. They've given out, and I think we have someone from Green Columbus that is listening in or watching, and maybe they could write in the chat about how many trees that they gave out for free. I know it's in the thousands. There's also Friends of the Lower Olentangy Watershed, Flow. They're really active. If you follow them on social media, you'll see that they're doing tree plantings, litter cleanups, invasive species removal, like all through spring, all through summer, all through fall. So it's a great way to get involved. But somebody asked, how can we get free saplings? Outside of those groups, another way is through our GreenSpot Community Backyards program, where we offer a $50 rebate off of a native tree, as well as $50 off of a native rain barrel, right? Or $25 rebate on native plants. So you can kind of get one of those rebates. And our friends at Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District, they administer that program for us. I know there's other jurisdictions in Franklin County that partake in that program as well. So we have a couple other questions. One is on Facebook, and it is this person is saying, I was told at the last BRED meeting that Council Member Brown committed to introducing a plan for the trees on private property by 2023, and hiring a consultant under contract to develop a contract to develop private tree protection by June 23rd. Where does this stand now? I'm assuming that's 2023, but versus.
Yeah, Dave. So I was there as well at the latest BRED Day of Action on the 10th. And yes, Councilmember Brown, as a city official, committed to a series of questions about the Urban Forestry Master Plan. Really exciting that BRED wanted to take that topic on for their environmental justice initiative. Yes, so the timeline there is to introduce public tree code updates by February of 2023, and then to have a consultant under contract to begin the private tree work by June of next year. So that's, I think that's what was said, but I just wanted to make sure that was super clear. The idea is that we're currently working on public tree code. We want to, we're prioritizing that. It feels like that's the sort of thing that we should do first, is make sure that the city is preserving all the trees that it can on our property, and then move to drafting something to protect trees on private property. We anticipate that will be more controversial, take a longer time. There's a lot of the public tree code is pretty standard across cities. Private tree code can really vary in terms of how trees are regulated, so there'll be more discovery and more public comment as well on that phase of the project. So thank you for bringing up those commitments. Our department is leading those projects and working with council and the mayor's office and other departments as well to get that done.
Cool. So I do want to give a shout out to Laura Fay. So she put on Facebook that 30,000 seedlings in 2022 from Green Columbus. And that was, I believe, not only in Columbus, but the surrounding areas as well. So that's a lot of seedlings, and hopefully they all make it. There's another question from Laura. She asks, are there discussions with Department of Public Utilities about incentivizing preserving trees by lowering stormwater fees?
I appreciate that question, Laura. So we did talk with public utilities when we were creating the master plan about stormwater credits, and their perspective was that they want to make sure it's something that they could, and one, Dave, I know that's your department, so this is just what a couple, when we were developing this plan at the time, there was a concern about, how do we make sure something, we can check and make sure it was done in order to actually give a credit. So what the comfort level was planting a new tree for the year that you plant a new tree. That is something that would be easier to check on versus preserving a tree year over year. That was not something we focused as much on versus planting a new tree. But that is something we haven't built out. That's a recommendation in the master plan, but we have to circle back to public utilities to build out what that program might look like.
Cool. So in the works. So do we have any other questions? I think we've gone through that. I know we're a little bit over on time, but I do appreciate Rosalie spending extra time here with us. Does anybody have any other questions? While you're typing that in, I did want to touch on something that's a little bit tangential, but it does connect, and that is NOAA funded project that the city received this year, and that is to do a heat map of the city at the ground level. So we'll have monitors, we'll have volunteers that will be driving set routes, we'll get data, and we'll be able to plot out the heat discrepancy throughout the city. And that way we're able to focus in on, like with our GreenSpot community backyards program, what areas do we need to focus in on and really push our tree rebate program. It'll also help with when the city is looking for putting in resiliency hubs. It'll help inform where those go as well. It'll dovetail off of what Rosalie talked about earlier with the tree canopy study. So with that, if you're not a GreenSpot member, join GreenSpot, and you can follow us in that adventure, columbusgreenspot.org, and you can see how you can sign up on there. But we're going to be needing probably about 200 volunteers. So it is no small undertaking. We have a lot of great partners. I'm not going to try to name them all off because I'll leave somebody out, but a lot of great partners, both other departments as well as outside environmental groups, academic institutions, to all make that happen. So if you're interested in that, you could always email me directly at greenspot@columbus.gov. Seeing that I don't see any more questions. So Rosalie, I don't know if you have any last words for us.
I appreciate the invitation, Dave. Folks can always reach out to me as well. Dave, if you want to share my email out, feel free. Or I think it was on the last slide as well, but however you want to do that. And I appreciate coming to be able to talk with folks and for all of your wonderful questions. This is a pleasure whenever I get to talk about this plan. I think it's really exciting work, and it's an honor to help implement it for the city. It is truly a plan that we co-created with the community, and the goals, we will not be able to do this by ourselves as a city. We absolutely need all of the partners that we can get to reach our goals. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rosalie. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good weekend.